It's clear, as you mentioned, that in Downing Street, Keir Starmer feels like part of the answer is just speaking from the heart and using the R word, which he did again this week when Sarah Pochin, the Reform MP for Runcorn and Helsby, appeared on Talk TV and said the sight of black and Asian people on television adverts drove her mad. Now, she subsequently apologised for that and was saying she was making a point about DEI in the advertising industry. But Nigel Farage was absolutely furious about those comments. And you see why, rather, from Keir Starmer's response, which was to come out again and say reform were racist. Wes Streeting, who's been very assertive in adopting some of these positions and some of this language himself, trying to audition to be a standard bearer for an alliance of Blairites and the soft left, perhaps, coming out and using the racist word as well. Now, is this the answer? Is this the answer to Labour's woes, to Labour's electoral woes? Is it all about pointing at reform and saying these guys are nasty, these guys are weird, these guys are a dark and malign force in British politics, and you might not like us, but we're willing to call a spade a spade? Keir Starmer also did this with Katie Lamb, who gave an interview to our colleague Josh Glancy on the Sunday Times last week. Rising Tory star Katie Lamb was talking about deporting people who already have indefinite leave to remain. Keir Starmer, again, using very morally unambiguous, unequivocal language to basically condemn comments by Tory and Reform politicians as racist. Indeed, he looked very emotional as he spoke about the Katie Lamb stuff. So we keep hearing the Prime Minister, who in the past would have equivocated, he would have triangulated, he would have been very, very cautious about using some of the words he's used to describe Tory and Reform politicians and their policy positions recently, speaking with that kind of moral clarity, condemning very easily, using the word racist. Now, Labour politicians in particular, particularly on immigration, have run a million miles from that sort of language and style of communicating in the past. But this is Keir Starmer's meat and bread. And this seems to be, by accident or design, I think it's now by design, even if it was initially an accident, Labour's new strategy.
When the history of this period is written, and we might end up attempting to produce a reasonable first draft, I think that a lot of people will say a seminal moment inside Downing Street was when Starmer distanced himself from his previous assertion that Britain risked becoming an island of strangers. We've spoken to people in Downing Street about this before, and they've said that it was sort of so extraordinary in that it's so rare that a Prime Minister would disavow something they had themselves said, but also demonstrated the extent to which Starmer is just naturally not comfortable using that kind of vocabulary. In this instance, it happened to have echoes of Enoch Powell, but Starmer is never in his comfort position talking about the risks of multiculturalism, the extent to which Britain doesn't resemble its prior self. Now, what in strategic terms did that pronouncement amount to? Well, essentially, it was an example of Keir being Keir. You get the feeling, we get to get the fact of this period in history is that there's been a coming together of a candidate and a machine, an individual, a person in Keir Starmer, and then a politics and a tradition, a tendency in McSweeney and his Blue Labour adjacent philosophy. Well, this was that sort of alliance, even for a moment, coming asunder. And the question then was, well, will Keir lean into being Keir more? And conference was a fascinating flashpoint because he used his pulpit as a moment to address the public and the party membership directly in order to describe Reform's policies on indefinite leave to remain as racist. And he made homilies to progressive, diverse Britain. We've used this phrase before, the country of cutting the oranges at half time. That was his shining city on a hill, a country of people, getting on, piling in together, slaps on the back, being nice, solidarity. And he essentially contrasted that with the dark and, as you outlined, Patrick, sort of morally unacceptable position advanced by Reform. And it seems now like we're getting more of that Keir. The way he got on the front foot condemning poaching. I should say the sort of commentariat and political world reacted pretty ambivalently to his attempt to characterise Reform's policy on definite leave to remain as racist, not least because it bears such resemblance to the sort of spirit and up to a point the letter of Shabana Mahmood's own position. But it's fascinating to see him pressing the R button again. And it does pose a question, which we were reflecting on earlier. And here we ought to credit Sam Coates, who is better than anybody at preempting where conversation in Westminster is going to turn and observing the undercurrents. And he was saying, well, is there any universe in which the number 10 operation stays as is and Morgan McSweeney stays in the current role of Chief of Staff if Starmer's attempt to resolve the strategic challenge posed by Reform is to consistently accuse it of racist? I just want to mention one point before handing over to Patrick, which is Maurice Glassman, the Labour peer who is sort of architect of Blue Labour, was so appalled by Starmer's description of Farage's policy that he personally spoke to Farage and apologised and said that it is dishonourable and a betrayal of the noble traditions of the Labour movement to have said that. Now, Glassman and McSweeney are not the same thing, but their politics are closely related and they share an underlying critique of the effect of globalisation and mass migration on the country. How long can the man whose existence and political story has been about disavowing the sort of third sector, lanyard class, progressive tendency within Labour, how long does he stay if his own boss is constantly oxygenating the idea that you can win against Reform on the basis of, to coin a phrase, they're a basket of deplorables and racist?
It's a really, really interesting question, isn't it? Because it exposes so much that is unsettled about this government, about this Prime Minister, and about the direction it wants to take. I think the key point you made there, Gabriel, was you have the Prime Minister and increasingly cabinet ministers coming out and using the R word, saying Reform are racist. This thing they've said is racist. Their policy on X is racist. While at the same time, so much of the government's bandwidth, the Home Office's bandwidth, is spent in service of the same politics, or not the same politics, but acknowledging that actually Reform's policy positions are reflections of deep public discontent with the way the immigration system in particular is working, right? So we're speaking in the week where there's a new flurry of activity in government. This was reported in the Times by our colleague Matt Dathan, where Shabana Mahmood is furious at the use of hotels. Keir Starmer wants them all shut in a year, and they want to house asylum seekers on disused military bases. Now, if Nigel Farage came out and said that tomorrow, what do you expect Keir Starmer would say about it? You know, Nigel Farage saying, let's put migrants in camps on RAF bases. I think actually the gut reaction of lots of the PLP would be to say it has quite dark historical connotations. Now, that's actually the stated policy of the government, right? So, you know, there's this growing gap between the sort of aesthetics of what the government wants to talk about and the reality of its policy, which I think is just storing up loads of problems to start with, particularly of Labour's electoral policy now is let's try and motivate progressives behind us. Actually, if you're a sort of progressive who's annoyed at the Labour Party for not being progressive enough, and you're not an idiot, right? Keir Starmer coming out and saying that's racist. If you are a sort of high-ish to mid-information progressive voter, you know, you have a Zach Polanski TikTok in which the leader of the Green Party says, you know, refugees welcome, you know, I hate billionaires, etc. Or you're aware of what the government has been doing on a range of other issues, apart from using the word racist a lot. So that's a big live question. It's pretty incoherent strategically. And yeah, this does raise the question that you've just raised. And it's one of the most delicious in Labour Party politics. You know, what does this mean for Morgan McSweeney and what we might call McSweeneyism?